Welcome to the Human Factors and Ergonomics Hub, a series of educational podcasts that showcase the connection between human capabilities and good work design, brought to you by the Human Factors and Ergonomics Society of Australia.
Hello, I'm Kath Jones, the General Secretary of the Human Factors and Ergonomics Society of Australia, and I'm recording this podcast from the country of the Whadjuk people and the Noongar Nation, the southwest of WA. I pay my respects to the Whadjuk people who have been the traditional custodians of the land I'm recording from for at least 45,000 years, and acknowledge their living culture and spiritual connection to Bulu or Perth and the Double Yarragon, the Swan River. Today, I'm speaking with Dr. John Chan, who is the Managing Director of Infinite Potential, which is an independent, not-for-profit think tank who work with governments and organisations to examine the dynamics that shape work environments and can affect the productivity and well-being of workers. And John is joining me from the other side of this nation, of the country of the Gadigal people of the Arawa Nation, who are the traditional custodians of the place we now call Sydney. So we also pay our respects to the Gadigal people. Hi, John, and thank you so much for speaking with me today.
Hi. Thanks for having me.
John, no problem, and thank you. John, perhaps you can start by telling us a little bit more about what Infinite Potential does and the types of projects.
Yeah, sure. So Infinite Potential, you kind of mentioned, we are an independent, not-for-profit think tank that conducts research and evaluation to develop kind of insights and practical solutions to address some of the pressing problems that we're seeing within the workplace. So we use a systems view to understand the root causes of problems and kind of help organizations make those kind of systems and systemic kind of changes that will create a lasting impact. For a lot of the big kind of problems we're trying to solve, too often we see a lot of the sort of Band-Aid kind of fixing some of the symptoms rather than really getting down into some of the root causes. So really trying to help organizations understand that. And so in terms of the types of projects, what we know is that work has rapidly changed within the last couple of years, right? We're really moving into a new industrial revolution with these quite amazing technological advancements such as AI. And our ways of working have also changed since the pandemic. Where we're working, how we're working, all of that has changed quite a bit. And also another thing that's kind of happened in the last few years is our relationship with work has greatly shifted as well. There's a lot more focus on our individual kind of well-being and mental health rather than just kind of focusing purely on work. And so all of these changes has really kind of pushed individuals, organizations, and even whole sectors into kind of I'll say a breaking point, but they're at a place where they're not sure how to move on. We've got a lot of this is how we used to do things, and it's not working anymore. And some organizations are trying to push cram everybody back into the pre-pandemic mold, and some are trying to advance, and so we're kind of seeing a lot of that. A lot of organizations, to their credit, they know that they need to change, but they just don't know where to start. So a lot of our projects is to help organizations kind of better understand some of their structural and cultural drivers for stress, and kind of using our past research, we've developed this framework which we can kind of help organizations pinpoint some of those core areas, or those kind of root areas where they need to start focusing on.
Well, that's fantastic. And so interesting that you say that the way we value and look at work has changed, even with the pandemic. So really the way we address work and work stressors has to change with it.
That's exactly right.
Fair? Yeah. Okay. Yeah. And I loved that. I was very lucky to attend your presentation at the Comcare National Conference in Canberra last month. And at that session, you discussed a little bit about burnout, and you introduced some of those changes in there. Could you tell us a little bit more about the key messages of that session that you ran?
Yeah, sure. One of those key messages I tried to get across, really sort of an overarching message, sort of exactly kind of what you said, is that we really need a shift. It's kind of a paradigm shift in how we conceptualize work and well-being in today's kind of transformed kind of workplace. Those traditional work models of we're all going to go to the office, that's becoming more rare. Although I know, having said that, there's a couple of big companies that just are forcing people back. And also the culture of kind of putting work above everything else in your life, that is kind of fading away quite a bit as well. And so, because of those type of major kind of changes, we can't make people go back to pre-pandemic works of working. So, we can, and some people are trying, but we know that that's not going to be how we're going to get the best out of people. And so there's a need to kind of design new ways of working that kind of balances the organization's needs with its people's needs. So it's not just trying to kind of fix things on the side, but I really do think there's a need to kind of, let's take a step back, or let's start with a clean sheet of paper. If we were to redesign the organization today, how would that look? So that's sort of a really big kind of message to kind of get people to really think about. We need a kind of shift. But another thing that I talked about during the conference was to kind of provide some insights from our state of workplace burnout study. And I'll just kind of quickly kind of talk about three of the main ones there. The first insight was that while women continue to experience higher rates of burnout year over year, men's level of burnout has actually dropped in the past 12 months. So, and also along those lines, women are experiencing lower overall well-being and feeling less supported by their organization. Meanwhile, men are actually experiencing higher levels of well-being and feeling like they're having stronger support by the organization. And this is quite a troubling trend. Burnout has always been kind of slowly growing in the past few years, but it's always been kind of equal between men and women. But now this kind of has increased the gap between men and women when it comes to kind of workplace stress and burnout. And another finding was that those working in a reduced working hour modality, so that's what we call something like a 4-day work week, 9-day fortnight, or any type of kind of reduced work hour for the same pay. When we looked at that group, they showed a significant positive outcome compared to those working in a more traditional kind of 40-plus hour work week. So we looked at things like engagement, retention, productivity, quality of work, and kind of overall kind of individual well-being. And so those working in that reduced work hour model have just across the board show much more positive effects, but also they showed a lot lower rates of burnout and also experiences with psychosocial hazards as well. And sort of the third point, which I personally am very interested and quite passionate about, is that we wanted to see if there was a link between burnout and loneliness. As we all know, loneliness is becoming quite a significant issue all across the board, across different demographics. And what we found was that more than half of those who are experiencing burnout are also experiencing loneliness. However, those feeling lonely, that has nothing to do, or that does not have any impact on a person experiencing burnout. So it statistically it only goes one way in the analysis for that, and that really kind of supports our kind of key points. One of our key points that burnout is a problem with kind of organizational structures and cultures, and it's not about the individual. We hear so often these kind of individually focused discussions about burnout. If somebody say, "Oh, I'm feeling all burned out," it's like, "Oh, why don't you go take a day off and and come back?" And that all assumes it's your problem. You go figure it out and come back.
Absolutely. One of the great reasons we've got you on the podcast, because systems thinking is really the only way you can address systemic issues. And if burnout is a systemic issue, you can't leave it to an individual, like you said. But I was fascinated particularly about in your discussion, you mentioned burnout was often mischaracterized as merely the result of working too many hours. And yet your study found that reduced working hours had reduced burnout. Perhaps you could tell us what were those other dimensions of burnout that are often misunderstood or not considered?
Yeah, that's a great question. So often we associate burnout with just the exhaustion piece, and so many times when research is done on burnout, they simply kind of ask about the exhaustion piece. But we use the WHO, the World Health Organization's definition for burnout, which includes 3 dimensions. The first one is exhaustion, but the second one is cynicism. And the third one is professional efficacy. Now, the cynicism one, that's when you start really kind of disliking your job, something that you used to be quite passionate about. You do not like anything about it. You don't like the people that you work with. You just grow quite cynical of all the work that you do in there. And we always say that is a very dangerous part for burnout. The exhaustion part, if you actually have time to rest, that can be kind of much more easily solved. The cynicism, once that kind of takes root, it's a very difficult thing to kind of climb back out of on the cynicism. And the third piece there on the professional efficacy, that's when somebody starts making more errors. Things take a little bit longer than they used to, and they just aren't as efficient as what they know that they can do or they used to be able to. And that actually starts attacking sort of your own kind of self-esteem, and you start questioning your own capabilities, like, oh, maybe I'm not cut out for this. Maybe I can't do this type of work. And again, that is a really difficult thing, much more difficult thing to kind of climb out of, and it's a much more dangerous kind of thing. We always say when people are exhausted, that they might leave the organization and go to a similar organization. But when they start growing cynical, and also they start feeling like they can't do the job, that's when people leave the sector as a whole. And we see this in education, in healthcare. That's when it becomes quite dangerous if you're kind of looking at it from that high level kind of view. Like in healthcare, if a nurse goes from one hospital to another, that's kind of bad for the one hospital, but that's fine. They're still in the sector. But when they leave the sector altogether, and we have lost a very capable nurse, that's when that becomes such a problem.
It's fascinating, and particularly when you consider, the research which found that women at the moment were experiencing burnout more than men. You are, I think, looking at potentially professions where people are leaving the whole profession and or leaving the workforce altogether. So what are ways in which, given that this is a difficult and systemic problem, and actually really almost impossible to fix once your cynicism, as you said, your doubts of self-efficacy start creeping in, how do we prevent this if it is beyond working hours, which causes burnout? How does one address burnout risks in a systemic way?
I think one of the biggest challenges, and this might be kind of going quite large here, is the challenge that we face is still this myth that there's a choice between productivity or being productive and a worker well-being. So a lot of leaders and organizations still have this mentality of that it's one or another. And so this is, and a lot of leaders out there, they might believe in worker well-being, but they believe it as it's a nice thing to do. Right? We'll get there, rather than this is a business imperative. We know and there's plenty of research out there that says you cannot be productive if you do not have a healthy workforce, and that's just something that we got to get right in kind of dispelling this myth that it's one or another. It's both. We can be productive and we can have a healthy workforce as well. So that's a big kind of mindset shift, and I don't just blame it on leaders, because there's a lot of leaders that believe in this, but they're kind of hand tied with the way that the organizational culture or even sector type of cultures. We've been seeing quite a lot there are particular sectors out there that it is a sector kind of mentality that it's a very difficult kind of thing to kind of change. And another kind of challenge that I see is that there's not actually a lot of answers at the moment, right? With all of this change happening, we're just trying to keep up at the time. And we're in a place where we're trying to adapt to all of these different changes, and people are really focused on what not to do. So, with some of the legislation on psychosocial risk and hazard, things like that, there's a lot out there on what not to do and what you shouldn't be doing. There's not enough answers out there about what we should be doing. Like, what are we working towards? What does a healthy, productive, and sustainable workplace look like? It's not just the absence of all of these bad things, but what is all of the positive things that we want to see? And there's really just no one knows what that looks like. And I think this is where organizational psychologists, those in human factors, can play the most important role here. We have the expertise in people, systems, and organizations, and we've got that scientific background to understand how to do experiments with different ways of working and how to evaluate different ways of working. So I feel like that's able to actually come up with these answers that we don't know the answers to yet, but I think we have the skills to be able to find that with sort of this unique skill set.
I love that you said that, and it's so true that we often know what not to do, and there's a great understanding, I think, of the big stick approach that we need to avoid breaching laws, for example, but that's not enough. What you're saying is that paradigm shift we need to understand that productivity is not mutually exclusive from employee well-being. One needs the other to work. You can't have productivity without that employee well-being. I really enjoyed, you had a blog post about something called well-washing, and I wanted to maybe dive into that a bit, because it kind of talks to that siloing of well-being in organizations. You mentioned that organizations where they are well-washing, they're addressing mental health and well-being using these performative kind of superficial strategies. And you said that actually undermines well-being. Can you explain how that happens?
Yeah, that's right. A lot of the what we call kind of well-being or kind of well-being initiatives that a lot of organizations do are very individually focused. So they really shift everything to the individual. And I think as a whole industry, so much of it's focused on the individual. Here are all of the things that you're doing or you're not doing that you should be in order to be well. All of those things kind of puts the blame on the individual for, oh yeah, you should have been doing this or you shouldn't have been doing that, when the pressures all come from the organization. And so, and I think we've, like, societal wise, organizations, they know what their employees are looking for, and they are saying the right things. But it's just unfortunate that a lot of times these are kind of shortcut things that just doesn't work. And all these well-being initiatives, there's quite a lot of research out there that says they really have no effect on these on the specific metrics on individual well-being. I think we're still think that fruit baskets are fantastic, which I love fruit. I think that's a great thing. We all love kind of getting a couple pieces of fruit from the kitchen,
yeah,
but it's
of course.
but that's not but that is not a well-being kind of a strategy. And and everyone's looking for that magical app, that either mindfulness app or resilience app or something like that can solve all of your burnout and well-being problems. We get a lot of sort of startups reaching out to us to kind of see if we'll either promote or do some type of evaluation on all of these on all of these tools are so individually focused on. We'll measure your heart rate, your sleep patterns, all of that, and we'll give you a burnout number. All of that. Again, it all puts the onus on the individual, on you're not doing this or you are doing this, rather than, hey, we need to do some things within the organization that might not sound like this shiny, pretty thing, doing job analysis, looking at job design. That's not super sexy, but that actually does that's what's going to have an impact on well-being for your people.
Yeah, it's so true. So what you're saying is where you are shifting that blame and that onus back on a worker to measure their own heart rate, to measure, their breathing exercises and whatnot. You're actually limiting an organisation's ability to address the key factors which could affect people's health and well-being. Yeah. So I really liked, and I think how you mentioned that. I think well-washing sometimes comes with the best of intentions, but it actually it has the opposite effect. And I heard someone say to me once that trying to find a person resilient to stress is like looking for somebody resistant to gravity to work at heights. So, there is no such thing as building a super person that can withhold all of the factors that could cause stress. So when we're looking at those, we take it back and say, how do we design this now for people who are in this post-pandemic world, who are thinking about their well-being and their, that they're working to live, not living to work, let's say. Mm-hmm. If we're trying to design work for these people, what are the key ingredients? You talked about changing the culture and changing the paradigm. Is there anything in leadership and specifically in job design which are easy picks to look at in terms of addressing organisational structures and how they might affect people's health and well-being?
Yeah, so our research, we've identified 5 elements that we consider are sort of essential for what we're calling a sustainable workplace. Mm-hmm. And we define a sustainable workplace as a workplace where well-being and inclusion are embedded into the workforce, and the workplace. And, really believe that we need to shift to this concept of the workplace from one that is just all about the needs of the organization. We pay you, and then we basically own you to do all of this work, to shifting from that to a workplace that actually can be a driver for performance and well-being. So kind of imagine, people, the workplace as sort of that engine for well-being. You actually go to the workplace instead of feeling drained and stressed. At the end of the day, you actually feel quite energized and have that sense of accomplishment at the end of the day. This kind of rethink is kind of what we need to create that sustainable and kind of engaged workforce that's going to be really beneficial for the organization and the people that work there. Now, in terms of those 5 elements, what we've identified, the first element is what we call the protection from harm. So that is looking at all the physical and psychosocial risk within the organization. That safeguarding the individual there, that's sort of always the first thing that needs to happen. The second piece there is looking at the leadership, what we call kind of human leadership. What we know from post the pandemic in the last few years is that what people are looking for and also what is effective leadership has really shifted in the past few years. Instead of that really kind of directive, the directive kind of command and loud kind of leaders, what we know is what people are looking for is those leaders who are leading with humility, curiosity, authenticity. Those type of leaders is a really important thing. And so and they're seeing if your organization's leaders actually have those type of traits, or to help them develop those kind of traits, is quite important. The third piece to kind of look at is what we call people-centered structures. So a lot of, and that's sort of looking at your job design, the workload, your financial remunerations and rewards. Just make sure that it is structured in a way where you have the person in mind as well. Too often, for example, within a job, you might be hired for a particular job, and every year you're there might be something that you get added on your plate, and nothing's ever taken off, and you kind of keep at it until basically that person has too much to carry. We never kind of go back to reevaluate jobs. So that's a really important part to do this. And the fourth element is what we call team connection. From our research and also a lot of other research, we know how important a strong, cohesive team is in terms of mitigator for burnout or stress. Everything else could be falling apart, but when you have a really cohesive team that looks out for each other, that supports each other, that is a really strong mitigator, and that's something that organizations really should focus on. As we start, everyone's cutting back on costs and things like that. First thing to go is always the sort of kind of team type of things, and that's actually the glue that you need to keep together if you're going to do other changes out there. And finally, the element of we to look at is what we call kind of personal growth. From our research, especially on burnout, you would I think most people would assume if somebody was burning out that they just want things taken off of them, so they're doing less work. But for every interview, every time we talk to somebody, they always mention, I want to feel like I'm still growing professionally and personally. And that actually is a good, a good mitigator from somebody experiencing burnout. Is when people are doing the same thing over and over again, they feel like they're in a bit of a rut and they just feel like a machine and just doing the same thing and not growing. That's when that seed gets planted, and that cynicism, all of that stuff starts growing. So ensuring that somebody is fostering that kind of personal growth is a really important element as well. So the combination of those 5 elements, we believe, if your organization is checking all the boxes for those 5 elements, you will create that really sustainable kind of workplace.
It's so true. And it really speaks to what I think we've been looking at with psychosocial risk management. We know that if you don't have a people-centered structure, if you don't have recognition, reward, or workload that's balanced with control and autonomy and clarity around your role, we know that can cause harm. But like you said, that team cohesion is a great example. That's such a strong mitigating factor, peer support. And we know that management support as well can be a very strong protective factor. They can be the reasons people leave the work, much more than the pay. Is that true from your experience? I mean, I'm pretty sure that's a well-known fact.
No, that's absolutely true. Although we did a piece of research a couple of years ago, and that was sort of the beginning of the really rapid rise in cost of living. And for the first time in history, sort of leaving a role for a higher pay did jump into the top 5, but I think that is a very rare kind of there was a very situational thing that happened a couple of years ago. But you're completely right. In general, that is not why people leave. So
that effective leadership, and I think when you're looking at the start, if we're still trying to use old models of work and old models of management, which may be directive, they may be less transformative or less, bringing people along the journey with you, it can really lead to issues, and we see intergenerational issues coming up in the workforce as well with behaviour. It's a fascinating area, John, and I'm interested to see what work could be done. I mean, obviously, we're looking at every workplace is going to be different, and there are some workplaces where, let's look at even working from home. We know that work from home, like you said at the start, is being enforced in some workplaces. If we don't enforce it, we might use a more collaborative leadership approach and look at who might want work from home. Is that something which may help in terms of having sustainable work, as you say?
Yeah, I think one of the kind of core elements of this sustainable work, I think we've lost this in the last few years, which is trust. I think we've lost a lot of trust between leaders and employees, and actually with organizations and people as well. And I think it got kind of exacerbated by during the COVID times. Most organizations were pretty good about we're going to take care of our people, and we've done all this nice stuff. And as we slowly get out of that, all of those habits have kind of dropped. And now with slightly more challenging kind of economic environment, we're seeing huge layoffs and all of that. So that trust has really broken between leaders and their people, and vice versa as well. And I think that's something we really need to kind of rebuild. Organizations can't say we care about you and then have a mass layoff. You can't do both at the same time. And I think that lack of trust is when all of these bad habits starts happening. On the other side as well, we hear about quiet quitting and all of these other kind of behaviors. It's because they don't trust that their organization that they work with has their best interest in mind. So they act poorly in some of these situations, and rightly so, because that's what they're seeing. And I think we've gotten to kind of your example about kind of working together in person. We've got a generation that has never worked in the office, or they've never seen some of the benefits of kind of being together in the same place, and kind of having that experience and kind of building the trust that way. And so they've never seen the good, they've only seen the bad. And that's why there is no trust, or there's very little trust with the organization. And if there's one thing that I think organizations really should focus on, it is do what you can to rebuild that. Some of these other problems will go away if you reestablish that trust with your people.
That's a really good point. How does one reestablish trust, though? If you're looking for, say, team cohesion as being such a key protective factor, we know that that's much harder if you're allowing people to work from home. It is harder for them to be cohesive as a team, and yet you really want to provide that trust to your workers to say, we believe that you're able to manage your own time and your own work output. How can we balance that? Because you want to give people the ability to work from home, for example, and you want to be able to trust them, but you also want to build that team cohesion.
Yeah.
It's a fine line, isn't it?
Yeah. Oh, definitely. Oh, it's definitely not easy. If we could think about our own lives, people that we try to build trust with, it takes a long time, and it's very easy to kind of break that trust. One of the things I would kind of suggest, or that I've been recommending, is we actually need to rethink what we do at work when we're together, and also when we're working remotely. When we're together, and this is, I think, something that organizations kind of do relatively poorly at the moment, because the talk is about, is it 2 days in the office, or 3 days in the office, 5 days in the office, and people come to the office and just do exactly what they do when they are at home. But I think what really needs to change is when we are together, we need to take advantage of the fact that we are together, and that people have spent the time, the money to get to the office. And so when we're together, the activities that we need to be doing is those things that works better when we're together. Those works about collaboration, about working, even like building more cohesion within the team. Do that there, and all of the other work that you can do that requires you to think, doing the emails, administrative stuff, do that when you're at home. I actually have a client that we work with. Now, they're a small organization, and so they can kind of be quite extreme about things, but when they're in the office, they don't do emails at all. They have a period in the very beginning of the day where they kind of check emails, and the little period at the end, but most of the day, there are plans for the work that they need to do together. Whether it's designing something or working on something, they do all of that together stuff during that period. And then the rest of the time when they're home, they do all of the kind of work stuff. And they have found, that made people say, hey, it's worth, me spending an hour on the train, and then the money, because I get to go and I'm hanging out with my team. I'm building my relationship. It's worth it, rather than I'm going to go to the office. I'm just basically going to be on Zoom all day, on Teams all day, which I could have done here
with your headphones on.
Yeah, that's right.
I totally understand, and I can see that also would play into how you get that personal growth element as well. Like you can't develop skills or find opportunities unless you have the activities that allow you to do that. And you're not going to get that from doing individual work. You get that from teams and from understanding what's available, what opportunities are available throughout that. Such a fascinating discussion. John, how can people find out more about infinite potential and the sort of work that you do? Can you tell us a bit about how you work and where we can find your services?
Yeah, sure. You can find me on LinkedIn. You could just look for John Chan on LinkedIn, or you can find us at infinitepotential.com.au, and you'll see sort of the type of services that we provide, and also all the some of the work that we have done before as well.
That's fantastic. And look, I really appreciated the chance to chat with you. I find this sort of discussion, particularly around moving the dial from individuals fixing the problem to organisations, looking at the whole of the structure, where people work, how they feel about work, how managers feel about work. It is so interesting, and I'm sure our listeners would have appreciated your time in that too. So thank you again, Pete.
Thanks so much for inviting me. It's been a great conversation. Really love being here.
Thank you.
Thanks for joining us at the Human Factors and Ergonomics Hub, brought to you by the Human Factors and Ergonomics Society of Australia, where human-centred design really matters. If you like this podcast, make us your favourite in your podcast app. We look forward to chatting with you next time.